Hey guys, welcome back. We are honored today to have the guest we have today. He has a Ph.D. from Warwick. He was the director of strategy for the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, society editor at The Observer, an economics correspondent at the UK Guardian, and he is currently a writer and scholar and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He is the author of a fantastic book called Of Boys and Men. Please welcome Dr. Richard Reeves. How you doing today, sir?
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you for coming.
No, great to be here.
Awesome. We got Rollo Tomassi on here, and we have a really great discussion. Dr. Reeves, you have done so many interviews, and I listened up pretty much all of them, and so I want to get to some.
God, I hope you haven't.
Hey, double speed while you're in the gym, man. You can get through anything. The thing is, I want to get to some second level questions. The first one that I have is, you wrote a book based completely on empirical data dealing with how, for instance, a great example was 13 percentage points women were attending college less than men back in 1975, and today it's 15 percentage points where women are attending more. About 60% of people enrolled in college are female. In this case, when you gave this empirical data, which side of the political aisle, because you've worked in the media and you've worked in government, which side of the political aisle has been more receptive to what you're doing or not receptive? What have been the receptions for you?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that just getting our facts straight is hugely important. Right? So I consider the work to be fact forward. Right? Let's just establish what are the basic facts, and then we can argue about, does it matter? Why is it happening? And it's actually 1972, and the reason why that's an important year is because that's when Title IX was passed to promote gender equality, and it's now a little bit wider. We have a bigger gender gap in higher education today than when Title IX was passed. It's just the other way around.
Yes.
So we have Title IX level inequality, but just the other way around. And what's interesting about that is that people who work in the field know that, right? So everyone who works in education, these are not secret facts. They're published every year. But it's then, how do people react to it? What I've discovered is that more conservative people probably were more likely to know that, because in some ways they've been talking about some of these issues perhaps for a little bit longer. People on the left perhaps a little bit less aware of it. And so I've been a bit surprised how surprised some people are to know that fact. They sort of knew there was a gap. They didn't know how big it was. Honestly, I didn't know how big the gap had gone. That's partly why I ended up writing the book.
The concept of being a former U.S. military aviator, the concept of there being more, as a percentage, more female military pilots than there are male kindergarten teachers.
Twice as many.
Twice as many as a share. That's really interesting. And then the idea, and we talked about this last night when we had the five models on here, and asked the number of male psychologists under the age of 30 being 5%. And the thing is, that has long-term effects, because those become the educators for future psychologists, and almost entirely female.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say is like as far as the stats and everything that you're coming out with, the reason I found you really interesting. I by the way, I was the one that suggested you be on Dr. Phil. This is the guy that was across from me. The reason why I wanted to talk to you about this is because I felt like we could have like a substantive conversation. And so I was like, it's not like gotcha media. We couldn't have that at Dr. Phil, clearly. Right. But I wanted to sort of continue some of the stuff that we were talking, we can even talk to each other behind the scenes. But I really wanted to be able to have that substantive conversation with you. And I want to thank you for coming in here and doing this with us.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think the thing about psychologists, to pick up that point, is that we know that there are these mental health problems. Right? And we know that men, for various reasons, struggle to get treatment a bit more than women do, but then we make it even harder by essentially having almost no male psychologists. When I wanted therapy, I was really, really happy to be able to find a male therapist. When one of my kids needed therapy, we were really happy to find a male with him.
I get that a lot too from the guys that I do counseling with. Like if I'm doing, I don't even really call it counseling. If I do a consult or an analysis with guys, like a one-on-one with them, if it gets to the point where I'm like, okay, this is like out of my pay grade, right? I will refer them to like a professional. But it's like, it's very hard to refer them to professionals, because it's like, where do I send this guy? He needs to talk to a guy. He needs to talk to another man who is like actually trained in this, and it's very difficult to do.
It is. It's getting harder and harder to find them. And I think, just in the spirit of what you said a minute ago, Rollo, I think the point of any kind of conversation around this issue or anything else is to have quite deep disagreements, but to do so on the basis of the substance. To say, well, here's how I interpret these facts. Here's how I see the world, rather than resorting to ad hominem, rather than just saying, well, you would say that wouldn't you? You're an X or a Y, and instead to have this conversation based on substance. So I expect we'll agree about some things. I expect we'll disagree about other things, but let's disagree about them on the basis of the substance.
I think and I was telling you prior to the show, is I think we will agree on the diagnosis. I think it's interesting right now that there's so many podcasts and there's so many influencers, and then people such as yourself who are recognizing that there is a crisis in masculinity at this point, right? I've been talking about this for at least the last 20 years, from my forum days up to where I'm at right now. I'm 5 books in. I've been following this sort of track, what we call the red pill, the manosphere track, for a very long time, and now it's starting to come into like the mainstream. Unfortunately, that comes with some advantages and it comes with some disadvantages. The advantages are we get to talk to you. Okay? Right. Some of the disadvantages is that we have to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff, which is what I was doing on Dr. Phil. I'm like I said, when I first got up there, I wasn't going to be an apologist for Andrew Tate. Right? If he takes the material that I've been writing about for the last 20 years and he decides to turn it into a business for himself, more power to him, but don't come to me and say, you're the reason why he is who he is. I'm like, no, he's bastardizing my work. So that's the disadvantage of having been in this for a very long time. But the advantage of it is that now even a gentleman such as yourself from Brookings Institute is realizing that, hey, this is really a problem. I'm going to write a book about it, even if you're from a different side of the political aisle.
Right. I also think that one of the problems is that if people like Andrew Tate, who we discussed on Dr. Phil, what he does is he picks up just a little bit of evidence, right? You've had David Buss on, people like that. There was this, I was thinking about the interview he did with Piers Morgan, for example.
Yeah.
Piers really hammered him on the fact that he'd said somewhere that women's mate value declined with age or something like that. And Piers Morgan was saying, you're really saying that a woman who's 35 is worth less? She's less valuable than a woman. How can you possibly say that? And what happened, of course, is that I suspect Tate had kind of half heard or half read some evolutionary psychology about that.
Ray picked it up from me, actually.
And then he
we always try to make a distinction between like sexual market value and like your personal worth.
Right. And it's but he's sort of he's stumbled across this term somewhere or other, right? And then he misuses it, can't defend it. Whereas, of course, it's relatively well known. In fact, Corinne Lowe, who's an economist, I've just done some work. I've just summarized a paper by her, which looks at a really nice online platform to look at male preference for female partners and what's the trade-off between their income and their age. But she shows quite clearly that for men who are worried about having kids, they are quite age-sensitive about the partner that they have because they know that women's fertility
reproductive career.
Yeah, and so you've got Corinne Lowe, this very well-respected economist, writing this stuff. You've got David Buss doing his stuff. Yeah. And then it pops up in this kind of very unhelpful way from people like Andrew Tate. And so that you see it sort of. I think Jordan Peterson had a similar problem when he used the term enforced monogamy.
Yeah,
right.
It's encouraged monogamy, but it's not enforced.
Horrible phrase, and if you don't know where that came from,
I know. Right. I was so frustrated when that happened. I know what he's talking about. I know what they're going to do to abuse him out.
Yeah, and he didn't really back it up properly either. And so it's the problem with this sort of half, having a sort of half sense of what's going on can be really dangerous.
Yeah. So for people who are wondering, you can read this in the book Data, which was written by the CTO of eHarmony, the idea that women get the most right swipes, for lack of a better term, between the ages of 23 and 25, and men somewhere between the ages of 38 and 44. These are just facts. Satoshi Kanazawa actually did a paper on this one time talking about the different ethnicities and genders that receive the most and least attention on dating apps, and he was completely and totally canceled for this because he made statements about African American women and Asian men, and because that happened, that nobody wanted to hear these statistics, and he had lost. I messaged him the other day. He's a professor of evolutionary psychology. He won't even come on the podcast because he had gotten so much negative press from
because
producing
people will jump
like,
all over him. You mentioned Piers Morgan, right? Now, what's funny is I know everybody knows the situation with the Tates. They're in a Romanian prison now. Even Piers Morgan is still on board with the Tates. Like, he's still doing material. He's still like talking about Andrew and Tristan right now. And then, are you familiar with what went on with Don Lemon?
Yes, recently? I saw that with Don Lemon talking about a woman not in her prime. Yes,
right. So apparently, like, people are saying, oh, he was a follower of Tate or something. Like, suddenly it's like it's the religion of the cult of Tate, and Don Lemon's one of the cult members, right? And it's like, no, he's just talking about stuff that he's probably picked up from someone. Yeah, and somewhere. If Don Lemon is talking about manosphere topics, it's like, okay, we're here.
Madame Curie discovering radium, that makes her a very valuable person throughout history. A woman who cures cancer, it makes them very valuable valuable. We're discussing a person's internal worth or worth to society versus how attractive they are. And unfortunately, we're conflating the two terms, and it becomes offensive. The idea a woman's value is her value. That doesn't have anything to do with whether or not a man, like you said before, choosing someone to have a child with. Those are two different things.
Sure. And it depends like why you're doing it. So actually, the reason I mentioned Corinne's work is she showed that the men who already had kids and weren't interested in having them, or men who didn't know about fertility and age, they didn't have the same age preference. And so that's very interesting, because what that tells you is that really is just a sense of like guys who know a bit about fertility and who want to have kids are thinking about that. And in the same way that you might say, let's say a woman has a preference for a guy who has a bit more upper body strength or has higher earnings or whatever. It's not to say he's not a better guy. He's not higher value. Right? You wouldn't say that a hedge fund manager is a more valuable person than a nurse just because he earns more.
Correct.
But you might say that in terms of this very specific technical term of mate value in certain mating markets, that is a factor. And so it's this inability to sort of just understand, like, here's what the science is telling us, without that necessarily becoming a moral thing. Right? You're not making a moral statement about value.
You just, and that's unfortunately we conflate.
It's an empirical. It's an empirical thing, and of course those things change over time. Like what makes a mate valuable is very different in one society and another, and it changes over time.
So let's talk about this. This is kind of a lightning rod. Is the pay wage gap, and you talk. So the number that people talk about all the time is 44 of the Fortune 500 CEOs, somewhere thereabouts, are female. But 1/10, like less than 1/1000th of 1% of Americans are Fortune 500 CEOs. You said at the highest strata, there is a wage gap. As you go lower down the strata, there's less of a wage gap. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, there's a wage gap at every level. Okay. So I think there's two different things going on there. One is the representation point, which is, and there is still this very strong male skew at the top of society, right? In Congress, in boardrooms, etc.
Apex fallacy.
At the apex, you see. And so if you only look around at the apex, you do continue. And there is still a lot more work to do, I think, to improve representation there. But the pay gap does occur all the way down. The thing that's important to understand, I think, about the gender pay gap is that it's largely now a parenting gap. It's largely the result of the different patterns of employment that men and women have after having had children. And to some extent, it's the occupations they're in as well. And so let's be horribly unfair to both sides. So a conservative would say, I see these videos all the time. The pay gap, the gender pay gap, is a myth, right? No, it isn't. It's math. It's true. It's in the data. What they mean by that is if you start controlling for certain things, like occupation, like how much time you've taken out of the labor market, you can essentially statistically explain the gender pay gap. It's not discrimination causing it; something else.
It's not endemic sexism that's causing it.
It's not the patriarchy.
Choices.
It's not the patriarchy. Well, then it raises the interesting question, right? Because then a thoughtful feminist would say, okay, is it really a choice? Are women really choosing to take their time out of the labor market? And why are they paying such a high price for that choice? So it doesn't take the question away of, is the gender pay gap a problem? It merely moves it to a more interesting place, which is, why is it that when women have children, their economic trajectory is massively affected and men isn't? And the answer is because of this difference in the gendered patterns of behavior. Is that really a choice, or is it the result of gender norms? Interesting question.
Or is it the result of evolved biology? I mean, women have children, men do not have children.
Correct.
Simple as that.
Correct.
So I mean, there's going to be a hereditary biological, and I'm not even like psychological, just a biological reason for the gender pay gap is actually a thing. It's just that, how do we explain that gender pay gap? Is it because of the choices that they're making? Is it because they feel like, any feminist is going to say, well, women are forced into this. They're left with no choice, and so therefore that's why that's the endemic sexism that they're saying is. But it's really, no, those are the choices you have a natural proclivity to. Do you have a maternal instinct? Well, then I guess you're going to have to make a choice whether you want to have a career or you want to have children.
But then the question becomes that how constrained is the choice, right? So it's and what price do you pay for making that choice? And the third thing is that a choice you're making for the next 20 years? Right? There's a very big difference between the choice you make, say, in the first year and the next 20 years. And so I do think a number of things are happening here. One is that actually you can structure the labor market in a way that really penalizes you for taking time out to care for kids. I took time out to care for kids, but I did that in the UK. And so it's not being made in a vacuum, right, this choice. So you could pay a lower price for the choice in the first place. Secondly, even if that's your choice for the first year or two, and I tend to agree that that's probably the result of some natural preferences than it is of socialization. It doesn't mean that that's set your course for the next 20 years, right? And so I think, and the reason I think that, by the way, is that you see women with very high levels of education and economic power making those choices, right? So, Claudia Goldin's work on Chicago MBAs and Harvard MBAs, you think, okay, those are very powerful women with lots of choices. If they are choosing, say, to work part-time when their kids are very little, that's probably a free choice, right? It's really hard at that point to argue that it's something else. And they're able to do so. And what's interesting is they're much more likely to do so if their husband's earning a lot.
Exactly.
And so it gives them the choice to do that. So I think we have to respect that choice without then saying that determines that's the next 20 years of your life. You should be a mum now for the rest of your life.
And meanwhile, in 2024 election cycle, we'll start talking about the 77 cents and the 81 cents.
But you also mentioned African American women are more likely to get back to work quicker because the statement that I think one person you had interviewed said something like, I wish I had the luxury of staying from home. I have to get back to work.
Yeah, and so if we make it quite hard for people to make that choice to be able to stay at home, and then actually you will see people returning. And it's very interesting. This is not a political point. You'll see people on the left saying that it's a tragedy that mothers are having to go back to work within 4 or 6 weeks of having their birth. Almost no one wants to do that. And so what that would mean is if we did have policies like paid leave, more opportunities for flexible working, etc., it wouldn't take away these differences between parents and non-parents, but it would soften the blow. Right now, you have to pay a very high price for taking time out of the labour market because we haven't reformed the labour market. We haven't made it easier to be a parent and be an earner at the same time. So I feel like we're stuck a little bit in an old model of work, which was like a buy one, get one free model. You buy the guy, the wife will raise the kids. And now that most couples, both parents work, we really got to update this labour market, not to take away the fact that there will be a penalty, quote penalty for working, but just does it have to be such a big one?
But even like as a traditional conservatives who might be watching this, they in one hand want people to have more children and want there to be more marriage, but you can't have that and then at the same time penalize women who are in the workforce and then say, well, you can't have a child and then still remain upwardly mobile financially.
Right, we make it a very, very hard choice for people, and then wonder why they're less likely to be doing it. This is a very weird debate right now because of declining fertility rate. There's a lot of social conservatives now who are freaking out about the fertility rate. And the main reason for that is there's less teen pregnancy and teen sex.
Yes.
People having less sex in their 20s.
People have less sex like overall. We'll talk about that.
And so they're now, well, wait, hold on. 10 years ago, those were the things you were worried about.
Yes.
You wanted people to have less sex.
How about kids not getting driver's license and now there's less drunk driving and underage drinking because of this whole thing. But now it's like, well, now these kids can't go up and talk to each other. They're learning how to socialize based on social media. Well, that's what you wanted, right? You wanted the kids to stop killing each other. And that's essentially what happened.
What you want.
Okay, I asked that this was one of my favorite points that you talked about was the American Psychological Association talking about the differences between men and women and aggression and absolutely leaving out hormones in the endocrine system and testosterone specifically. Men on average have about 17 times as much testosterone as women do. It has to do with things like assertiveness and aggressiveness and upper body strength. Men are about twice as about 100%, 90% stronger in their upper body, 50% stronger in their lower body. There are serious dimorphic differences between the genders, and the American Psychological Association doesn't seem to recognize any of this.
Yeah. I mean, that became an infamous report.
Well, it's worse than that, David. They declared traditional masculinity a personality disorder.
They got into a real mess. I mean, it was a horrible mess. The report was weak, and the summary was worse. And what was interesting about it was quite instructive because they then tried to tweet out a clarification when they got into trouble. And they said, no, the report actually says there are good things about traditional masculinity, like leadership and courage and stuff, which, by the way, it didn't. But then they got attacked from women's groups by saying, are you saying that women can't be brave?
Right.
So they actually ended up losing everybody.
Win.
But the thing that I ended up focusing on was, so I said, okay, so they have this report on boys and men that treats boys and men as blank slates. There's no biology, as you say, no mention of testosterone, no mention of puberty, etc. I wonder what the one on women and girls does. So they had a previous report on women and girls that talks about puberty. It talks about fertility. It talks about menopause. It talks about the impact of hormones on your psychology, so that women, therapists who are working with girls and women have that information as they're working with them. But none of that was in the one on men. So they ended up with this position where they treated women and girls like flesh and blood, right, as having biologies, having bodies that affect their psychology, but not men. And that's an extraordinary position to end up in, given that the advice was supposed to be to help psychologists deal with men.
Well, I think one of the interesting things, when I had Dr. David Buss on, he said all psychology is an evolutionary psychology. And a lot of people in psychology don't like that idea because it is so counter to the blank slate ideology, right? That I personally believe it's more than 75% of our proclivities come from evolution. Like, again, I don't particularly like snakes, spiders. People generally, you don't have to teach them to be afraid of heights or to the smell of sulfur to be, disgusting. Those are things
revulsion response.
Yeah, exactly. Those there's a lot of it that's already in there. So I think it was interesting because when you do speak to a lot of psychologists, and some of them who are politically progressive, they want to go away from that. And a blank slate theory actually makes it a lot easier. So when you treat women as biological objects and treat men as sort of like the only reason they are more assertive is because of a cultural construct.
Yes.
But no, it can't be because of their biology. No, that doesn't make sense on both ends.
It just ended up in an intellectually untenable position of saying like we're going to treat one sex as entirely, we're going to treat masculinity as entirely socialized, but femininity is partly biological, which is clearly insane. But I think David Buss is an evolutionary psychologist, so of course he would say it's all evolutionary. Right. I think that the real debate here is like every sensible person will say, look, of course biology plays a role, not only in our bodies, but in our psychology and preferences, right? No one sensible denies that altogether. They'll just say, but it's not very important. What they'll say is society and culture are much, much, much more important.
Yeah, right? Overwhelmingly.
So the real debate here is not is it A or B, it's how much weight do you put on A or B. And I think that what frustrates me about this debate is if you force people to either say, look, the reason that everything we do is explained by our ancestral biology, right? Or to say, no, it's all entirely socialized, misses the fact that culture is actually the mediating variable here. So let's take aggression, for example. Like, is it true that men have more potential for aggression? Yeah, duh. And nobody serious doubts that. But the fact that we have like half as much violent crime today in the US as we did a few decades ago, the fact that Singapore has so little by comparison to Malaysia, the fact that over the course of human history, we've seen these massive changes in the expression of that aggression. Even in my own life, right? My kids, my boys have never really been in, I have 20, they're all in their 20s. They've never been into physical fight.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait, how is that possible? Given how I grew up. This is amazing. And so what that means is that even if it's true that proclivity, you use that word very carefully, I like it, proclivity differs, it doesn't mean it will necessarily be expressed. Yeah. That's where culture comes in. And so that's actually acknowledging the role of biology doesn't make culture less important, it makes it more important.
Yes.
I tried to make that point with Imran Ahmed when he came at me and said, do you know the number one killer of women in the United States, which is of course heart disease, but he comes at me and say, well, it's violent, men being violent with women, right? And it's like, well, and then the number one killer of men is also men on top of that.
So 90% of murders are committed by men. 80% of the victims of those murders are men.
Yeah.
Men. So I'm trying to explain. Really, what I think where the disconnect is in all of this is prioritizing what it's nature and nurture, right? And from my perspective, and I believe from Dr. Dave Buss as well, is nurture doesn't happen without nature. Nature is what prompts the nurture. There's like family and society and all that comes from the fact that you got to hook up with a girl in the first place. Your first tribe is your family, and so it's downstream. Like nurture is downstream from nature, I think. But then there's a lot, like you were saying before. There's this social constructionism narrative that says, no, you're violent because society made you that way, or society tells us X, Y, and Z. Rather than saying, no, we have a natural proclivity for that because we're human beings and the machine hasn't changed in 100,000 years.
Right. So the danger is that then if you, by acknowledging that there are some biological roots, these differences in productivity, that you drift into a form of determinism.
Right. Then the devil made me do it. The biology made me do it.
Yeah.
My selfish gene made me do it.
Yeah. Or that we end up saying that like because you're male, you're going to be like this. And because you're female, you're going to be like this. And first of all, we miss the importance of culture, which hugely affects how we actually express our differences. And secondly, it misses the fact that those distributions, depending on the thing we're talking about, they overlap a lot.
Yes.
Right now, some overlap more than others. And so the reason people don't like this conversation, and they're right to worry about it, is because in the wrong hands and historically, the invocation of biological differences has been used to oppress women. It's been used to say, yes, you are different, and that's why you should stay at home and be mum. Yes, you are different, And that's why you can't be in politics. You are different. That's why you can't be an engineer or a fighter pilot or a journalist or whatever you want to choose.
In that case, I would say that
against women.
Then that becomes equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. So, like, if you go and you look at, like, say, Scandinavian countries right now, which are supposed to be the most gender parity countries in the world right now, you still see that men and women tend to opt for traditionally and conventionally gendered roles in society. Women are still looking for a guy who's a high-value man who makes a lot of money and want to have babies with him and go on into perpetuity. So I understand what you're saying, but there's also the opposite side of that, which is do you have the opportunity? If you're a woman and you want to be a fighter pilot, should you have the opportunity to do that? Yes, if you can merit that position, absolutely. But it's another thing to say, well, we need more fighter pilots and we'll lower the standards so that you can be a fighter pilot, and because we need to
I think
until we get to 50-50
in the case, just speak specifically on this. In the case of infantry, you would have to lower the standard. In the case of fighter pilot, you would not. It actually, being a fighter pilot, actually, you are better off being a smaller human being to be a fighter pilot. 6'8" people do not make good fighter pilots. So actually, for that case, to be a Navy SEAL, no, it would be you would definitely have to lower the standard, especially for things like push-ups. You would have to lower the standard for women in order to do that, but not to be a fighter pilot. So that's the reason why I don't think in that specific issue it's an issue, but it is when you talk about infantry.
Well, I think one of the hold that thought. Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons why we're having this discussion right now is because we're at a point, like, we're 22 years into the 21st century right now, and I think that we have more access to data and more access to the research and everything else that we didn't have before. Like, I can go and write 5 books on intersexual dynamics, and I don't have a degree in evolutionary psychology. I have a degree in behavioral psychology, but I do not have it in that particular field. But what's happening, I think, is exactly what you're saying. Is like it's by order of degrees. Like you're saying, like, in the wrong hands, if somebody has this information, they want to sort of promote a narrative by using the devil made me do it, or my genes made me do it. Yeah, we've been talking about that for like 20 plus years now in the manosphere. But, like, for instance, I get this all the time. People will say, well, Rollo promotes this idea of hypergamy, and it's like a straitjacket, and you like, if you get with a woman, she's just going to want to get with the next best guy, right? I've never said that. I've wrote essay after essay trying to explain the variables and all the things that go along in that in the mate selection process. But all anybody ever wants to do is come back to that sort of that determinism. And I understand what you're saying. I get it, because it happens on both sides. It happens in our sphere and probably outside of our sphere.
So because it's just so much harder to hold 2 thoughts in your head at once. We tend to do it's just much easier to hold 1 thought in your head at once, right? And to say that, and to say, oh, it's pretty simple, right? Rather than actually recognizing
binary versus nuanced.
Yeah, and it's incredibly complex. And so you made the point that, like, of everything else equal, women would prefer men who are earning more. Well, it turns out actually that men also now prefer women who are earning more. And, like, I mean, it's great to have
having more money is
more
great.
Money is good.
Money is fun.
I think where it becomes an issue is how you look at the patterns as they kind of roll. We got into this a little bit on Dr. Phil, but never really went into it. I criticized Jordan Peterson for saying that the reason that only 5% of engineers are women is because women are more into people and men are more into things, right? There's this people-things distinction in psychology.
He pulled that from Dr. Pinker too.
Right? And it's true. And it's true that on average there is that difference between, men are a bit more into things and women are into people. But that's one of those distributions that overlaps a lot.
Yes.
Right. So that's why my sister-in-law is an engineer and my son is an early years educator, because they overlap a lot. And I was recently convinced by some evidence that I cite in the book from Rong Su and James Rounds, some psychologists, who said that under conditions of total equality of opportunity, to
about 30% of
about 30% of engineers would be women, and about 30% of nurses would be men, and that feels about right to me, right? Because it's not 50%, and we're not going to socially engineer society to make sure that everything's 50%, and some will be less than that, by the way. So maybe deep sea fishing, for example, won't get 30%. But that felt right to me. But at the moment, it's 15%. And 30%.
You've been watching my Instagram, haven't you?
But 30% is a lot more than 5%.
Right? So come from statistics. One plus or minus 1 sigma, 1 standard deviation is 68.27%. So that would be about 70%. So outside of that 1 standard deviation, so male nurses or female engineers would be outside that, about 32%. That's where that number would come from.
That's and it's going to vary, of course. So that's just one example of an occupational distribution that can be explained by differences in the preferences of men and women. But the danger, again, it's an example. So it was the same argument when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979 when I was 10. There was still people saying, well, like, politics isn't really for women. You know, they're not as interested in status. They're not as obsessed with leadership. They're not into power in the same way. And at the time, only 5% of British MPs were women, right? When Thatcher became Prime Minister. Well, Margaret Thatcher, I think, was a pretty good counterexample to all those stereotypes. And now...
And a politically conservative one.
Yeah. Right. And now a third of MPs are women. The Conservative Party is the only one that's majority male. And so it's like, well... If there was something different between men and women that explained that there are different appetites for politics, is 5% really a realistic explanation of that? No. So you get these. So on the one hand, you get people saying women won't do this because their brains don't work like that, and men won't do that because their brains won't work like that, and they apply it to the whole population. And then other people who say until everything's 50-50. We're not in an equal society.
Yeah, neither of those things are true.
Yeah. No, neither of those things are true. And so the truth is somewhere in the middle, somewhere between the... And guess what? It will vary depending on the question you're asking. Correct. So distributions around aggression don't overlap very much. Like Carol Hooven's work on testosterone, for example, like she has this great chart showing the overlap between men and women in levels of testosterone, and it doesn't overlap. So it's a very striking chart. And so to the extent that testosterone is driving certain kinds of behavior or proclivities, to use your word, then that's going to differ very significantly.
And hold that thought. I am of the opinion, anyways, that women organize society differently than men. Men organize societies in hierarchies, like the chief. And we do it with our businesses. We do it in the military. It's like the chain of command. Everything is very, very hierarchical. It's status based. Whereas for women, the way that they organize societies is more community. It's more communitarian. It's more egalitarian. It's
more horizontal.
And that's why we have. That's why we're talking about like democratic socialism and stuff in the United States right now. It's because we have more women in the political process, and you see how I wrote about this in my fourth book. You see how when women get political power, how they use it and how they will choose to use it differently than guys. Men use power in stages, in hierarchies. Whereas women use it more in the round. They use it more in a communitarian way. And again, this goes back to our hunter-gatherer days, where we got the women who are the gatherers who rely on each other. It's the nurture part of all of that. And then the men have to go out and kill the caribou. And then there's guys who are on that status hierarchy. So when we get women into the American workplace, for example, we put women in there and they're starting to call the shots in the American workplace. Then you see much more community initiatives, like for instance, like pregnancy leave, which I don't disagree with, right? I think that's a great idea for them to have. But again, the structure of that company was created based on a hierarchy against other guys who created another company who are structured on a hierarchy, and they're competing against each other to wipe the other guy out because that's the competition idea. So the way that women organize society and the way that men organize society are like very different, and again, because of a natural proclivity for those things.
Well, of course, now you sound like a radical feminist. If I
There we go. There's the TikTok clip right there. You go. Radical feminist, Rollo Tomassi.
That's the argument that you get the argument that if women ran society, we wouldn't have recessions. We wouldn't have wars and so on. Right. And because they have this superior, in this telling of it, superior morality, which is more horizontal, more communal, etc. It's less aggressive, less status organized, less risk-taking, etc. And what's interesting about that is like, where would you go with that thought? I came across one study which was dangerous because it immediately conformed with my priors, right? So you have to be very careful about that. But what it found was, on average, like men are more risk-taking than women.
Yes.
Right? That seems to be one of those pretty standard things. Right? Proclivities, pretty standard. And then they applied that to the business setting. What they found was that companies that were run by women, with a woman CEO and COO, tended to be less likely to go bankrupt, but were a little bit less profitable. The ones that were run by men were a bit more profitable, but were more likely to go under, right? Yeah. And so that was very interesting.
Win big or go home.
And so that was perfectly consistent with this difference that you'd expect. So what do you do with that? It seems to me you don't either say, we want a society that's one or the other. What you do is you say, let's get a bit of balance in there. That seems to be a very good argument for boardroom diversity. And maybe what's happening is that more women are coming into the economy is changing in ways that mix, quotes, masculine and feminine virtues and values, which, given that we are 50% female and 50% male, is surely a good thing. We don't want an economy run by men or by women. We want an economy run by both, because we all have to live in it,
there was a paper done where you're speaking at UNLV right after this. There was a paper done there where they actually looked at men betting, gambling when there were attractive women nearby. They found two things. Number one, testosterone serum would increase, and number two, they would bet bigger.
Right.
They would bet bigger when women were around. The other thing I want to talk about was the idea of the distributions overlapping. This is my favorite city to ever live in. Carolyn Goodman is our mayor, and she is a hardline conservative. Like, she wanted us back. She wanted to get the masks off, get us back to work immediately. And you find that some cases, like where there are some women, some women, and I found this also being a U.S. military officer. Some of the hardest commanders I ever had were women, because they understood the judgment that was put against them, starting off as being a female. So the lieutenant colonels that were my squadron commanders were some of the least funny, most disciplined, hardline people that I'd ever met because of that situation. So the distributions overlap.
And Margaret Thatcher's a good example too. And so what that means is the fact that we acknowledge these differences on average doesn't mean we treat any individual differently, right? That's what economists call statistical discrimination.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, that's where we have to be very careful, because if people hear this language, they hear, oh, there are these differences, that can feed into their decision making. And I don't want my sister-in-law to be discriminated against as an engineer just because on average there are going to be fewer women who are engineers. But nor do I want my son to be discriminated against as an early years educator just because on average there are fewer men interested in that. I don't want them as individuals to be treated any differently, even if the overall distributions are different. And that's it's a hard thing for some people to get their head around, which is, how can I treat you as an individual, right? I want my son to be able to be in early years. I don't want them, and he does face discrimination, right? I don't want him to face that discrimination because the distributions are different.
Let's talk about this. This is one of my favorite discussions. In the early 90s, psychologists were they were investigating, studying violent felons in prison. And when they saw these violent felons, they would come attack each other. They would disrespect each other in a slight way. Then all of a sudden the shanks come out and there's like murder, homicide. They would term this toxic masculinity.
That's where the term
came from. That it was you, and that is toxic masculinity. You stepped on my shoe, therefore I'm going to kill you. That is toxic masculinity. When you study some of these people, they had insane levels of testosterone, and you saw there were some mental disorders included. Somehow academia now gets a hold of that term, and now it means the reason why more men die from COVID is because of toxic masculinity. Global warming is because of toxic masculinity. Everything. And you spoke about that at length. Can you go into that?
Yeah, and actually there is a different version of it that was used by Robert Bly back in the day in a very different way. But you're right that in academia it had quite a technical term. Yeah. And it was this very specific group of very violent incarcerated criminals. And it's Carol Harrington, a feminist scholar who I quote. I think she said that before 2016 it was getting on average like 12 mentions in obscure academic journals, and then suddenly, kaboom, it broke into the mainstream and became this very common term, toxic masculinity. Very rarely defined, as she says, just used generally to signal disapproval. And it has been used to explain everything from recessions to wars to climate change to mask wearing to you just name it.
It's the boogeyman.
Yeah, and because it's not really defined, it just means you can use it pretty indiscriminately. And I've come to believe that it's a very, very unhelpful term. Actually, many feminist scholars believe that now too, because it pushes men away from the discussion. I think just putting those two words next to each other is a profound error. And also just because intellectually, when you actually push people and say, okay, they'll say, no, I don't mean all masculinity is bad. There's non-toxic masculinity.
Right, now
first of all, okay, I still don't like this toxic, non-toxic. I actually prefer something like mature and immature. But maybe we can get into that. But it's okay, so what's non-toxic masculinity then? And then they'll say,
I can tell you. I can tell you exactly what this.
What is that?
Whenever we get into talk, I was hoping to have this conversation with you on Dr. Phil.
I'll finish my thought, but they'll say courage.
Yeah, something ambiguous.
And then you say to them, what, are you saying that women aren't like
exactly right.
That's the hardest part.
Women say, no. Women are equally likely to be that.
Then what's masculinity?
So what? It's like what Matt Walsh is. What is a woman? They can't give you a concrete, definitive answer. The same thing as what's toxic masculinity, or what's good and what's bad.
But the bigger problem, I think, is just this language around it.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Is like I'm on the record as saying there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There is only masculinity, and there's the aspects of it that are useful to a female imperative, and then the aspects of it that are inconvenient. So the guys doing the stupid stunts on Jackass, that masculinity is the same masculinity that prompts the firemen to run into the burning building and save the baby.
It's risk taking.
It's the risk taking.
Yes, back to this.
What is the context that it is used in? And so whatever is convenient to a female imperative, that's non-toxic.
That can be when
the floodwaters rise and you need men to save you from the floodwaters. That's non-toxic masculinity.
It can be an unhelpful expression of it, or a positive one. And so let's take risk-taking again, because this is all more... Men, on average, more risk-taking than women.
Yes.
Good or bad? Answer, yes. It depends.
Yeah.
It depends
What's the context?
entirely. When you want someone to run into a burning building to save a stranger, good. or maybe explore or something like good, right? When it leads them to do something dangerous to themselves or to others, bad.
Goldman Sachs.
So what we do is we
pro-social, anti-social.
So we have to learn, whoever we are, to say, okay, here are these proclivities. When and how should I express them? When is it going to be helpful to express them? When is it going to be pro-social to express them? And the thing that a culture does is help us learn that. But it doesn't teach itself. It doesn't happen automatically. It has to be learned. And I had this quote from Margaret Mead, which I've used a lot because I've used it so much that I've got it basically to memory. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, said, every known human society has rested on the learned, nurturing behavior of men. This behavior being learned is quite fragile and can disappear quite quickly under circumstances that no longer teach it effectively. And the reason I think I've got that committed is because every single word of that feels true to me, is that this idea of learned nurturing behavior, and she means nurturing in a broader sense, by the way, like caring for the community, caring for the tribe, but like men can nurture, but it's more learned for men, right? So we have to teach it. And if we don't teach it effectively, it will collapse. And so it seems to me crazy to say that we don't still have to think about how do you go from being a boy to a man or a girl to a woman. That's a cultural task that we're all engaged in. It doesn't do it by itself.
That learning process right now, I think, is at the root of why the conversation we're having, the larger conversation we're having, at least in the manosphere and really in popular culture now, is like, why are guys such pussies? Why are guys manginas right now? Why can't we find guys who like will man up and take responsibility?
Why do you use that language? Though?
Well, the reason I'm using that
because
I'm using that language because that's the language they use. That's the language that women on this show use. That's the language that they're using
it now. And I think as soon as you use a term like that, it immediately makes people react.
So let's just say they become more feminized. They become more. I was just reading that. We were reading that article last night on Access Vegas. And we're talking about how, 63% of men are not in relationships and like 37% of women are in relationships.
Just come out.
And so their solution, the researcher's solution to this is that men need to become more female and more feminine to appease and to be a better partner for women. And then therefore they'll solve their problems. I'm like, no, that's actually what's been causing the problems up to this point because they're pussies. I mean, again, their words, not mine, but the fact of the matter is that we're saying that men today are just not men anymore, and that's why we're having this conversation on God knows how many different podcasts.
Well, I think this is maybe where we're going to get into an interesting area of disagreement. So I think where we agree is the future is not and should not be androgyny.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
But we do want equality.
Yeah.
Right. Not equalism, which is I think what you call it, but equality without androgyny. So recognizing these differences, but still having equality.
And that's the trick, isn't it?
And I think, for example, and I cite this in the book, the fact that 40% of women now earn more than the average man, which is up from 13%, is a great thing. I think that the securing of economic independence to a very large degree by women in the last few decades is the greatest economic liberation in global history and a wonderful thing. It has all kinds of second-round consequences for how we construct.
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's downstream consequences of that.
And people warned about that, right? They were saying, but you don't have such a massive social and economic change without consequences. Of course. And in particular, in this case, asking a very real question about what about the guys? What does this mean for men? But would you agree that the fact that women are now economically powerful and have secured a high degree of economic independence, that's a good thing?
I think as far as society is concerned, as far as like the economy is concerned, I would say yes and no. Again, I'm going to focus on the idea that there's downstream effects as a result of that. I'm not saying we send women back to the 1950s or whatever again. Like what I'm saying is, because I'm on the record of saying like people wanted to say, should we take away women's right to vote? Should we put women back in? I'm like, first of all, that's untenable. That's never going to happen. So I wouldn't lead with that. I wouldn't even have that. I would not even have that conversation because you're simply not going to do that. But women are the largest voting bloc, at least in the United States. I know women decide elections, and so what happens is you see political parties stoking that emotional insecurities on women so that they can get a vote. That's neither here nor there. But as far as the economics is concerned, what I get into, and I've done this with Robert Kiyosaki. I was hoping to do this with Dr. Phil. But when I am talking to women and they say, Rollo, I can't find a guy. I am 36 years old. I did everything I was ever told to do. I got my career on point. Right. I got my money on point. I've got everything else, and these guys just aren't living up to my expectations. They're not making as much or more than I am. They're not eligible bachelors.
They haven't got their act together.
Right. Yeah. And so then they say, well, what's the solution to this? I said, well, guys who are in your particular cohort don't want to have anything to do with a woman who's a professional woman who's 36 years old, whatever it is, has her own things together, because you don't need a man. And I try to explain this like this is the superfluous thing conversation I had with Dr. Phil. They don't need a man. They want a man because they don't need that man for independent women are independent of what? Of men and their support. So they don't need that. They
make $300,000 a year and they have
That's part of that downstream effect.
So I read the evidence on this a couple of things differently here. One is you mentioned this point about the politics here and the emotional insecurities of women, I think is the phrase you used. I think right now it's the emotional insecurities of men that are being exploited by politicians on the right.
How so?
By pointing to the fact that men are struggling. Senator Josh Hawley, who has his own book coming out.
But we're saying that from both sides of the
They'll say, oh, you're losing power, or what's happening, the feminists are coming for you, society's turned anti-men, et cetera, et cetera. And actually that becomes a very powerful message for men who are really struggling. But actually, so that sense of like men struggling emotionally, economically, educationally is then weaponized by reactionary conservatives to say, yes, you are struggling and it's their fault, the feminists' fault. So vote for me and I'll bring back the 1950s, basically. So I think actually right now, it's the emotional insecurities of men that are being politically exploited. But secondly, my read of the evidence about what both men and women want in each other is just very different to yours. When I look at what they want, there are some differences between them, but they want someone who's got their act together, who's kind of, purposeful in life, etc. Men actually do want women who are similarly educated to them. They do want women who are succeeding. And that's what all the evidence suggests to me. Now, so this idea that the men who are out there, so college-educated men, like men who are doing well, the idea that they're out there looking for a kind of like just an old-fashioned wife who's going to look after them, that's just wrong. They're all assortatively mating into, they want college-educated wives. They want equals in their marriages, don't they? That's what I see in the evidence.
So let's talk about this. There's two things going on here. Number one, when we talk about a social contract, like a Magna Carta, one of the things that happens is we didn't want teenage pregnancy. We didn't want so much violence. And in doing so, while I believe the lowering of the amount of violence, I grew up in Texas in the 1990s during a crack epidemic. Wow. The level of violence was just untenable, right? Though at one point the murder capital of the U.S. was Oak Cliff, Texas. At one point it was Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Like it was horrible. Now, what happened during those times is we wanted less violence, and as a result, now boys don't get into fights in high school like we did. I look back at that time and I'm like, well, when there's a difficult time coming, because I've done difficult things, I can deal with it better. And now my son, who will have never been in a fight in his whole life, probably, he's not going to be able to deal with those things the same way. And as a result, you use the word pussies. I would not use that word, but like that's essentially what's going on, is that we've made this social contract. Another part of the social contract is the idea of where women were not earning as much and now they're earning a lot more. And from a societal standpoint, who knows? A woman may cure cancer. The point is, from an economic standpoint, that's good. What his point is, though, that doesn't make us now want to marry her because she's got a master's degree and a Ph.D. And so we've got this, what Dr. Buss would call like an evolutionary mismatch, where we're going to have women who make $300,000 a year wait until they're their mid-30s to get married, and then they're like, where are all the good guys? Because that's the problem that they're having.
That's the survey evidence you quoted earlier from Daniel Cox actually shows that there's very high expectations that college-educated women have of men, much higher expectations. Yes. And that half of them are saying the reason they're single is because they cannot find a man who meets their expectations.
And yet 40% of men are now attending college, and like 32% of them are graduating.
So the question is what happens going forward. I'm reasonably confident that we're all just going to have to update our views of the world and what we're looking for in a mate, because that's just like, that's the way the market's going to play out. So right now we're still figuring that out, but we're all going to have to change the way we think about this. But I got to tell you, like,
so that's the difficulty
when you say
right there.
I would like a woman who's earning $300,000 a year and has a master's degree. Thank you very much. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And it's not just because of the money. It's because an accomplished, professional, intelligent, successful woman who's like killing it at whatever she's choosing to do. That's incredibly attractive, I think, to a lot of men. And probably to most men. There are very few men out there who don't want their daughters or their wives or their sisters to be very successful professionally and economically. They then want them to have the choice to be able to do what they want without those resources. But I think you're wrong if the suggestion of what you're saying is that, secretly, the guys out there, they just want women to be the way women were before.
No, it's not that. But the problem is, if you have a group of men, Bill Maher, he said this on one of his shows, is like you have a group, you have these women where 60% of them are going to college, and I believe 68% of them are the graduation rate. If you have that issue, now you have a bunch of men without college degrees. Now you have a bunch of women with college degrees, and their dating pool are men without college degrees. Yes. Then what happens, the standard before was, he was this big, strong dude who could provide for me. Now it's like, I have a Glock. And I can protect myself.
And Bill Maher's done, actually, Scott Galloway and others have, and actually, a lot of people are worrying about this. I'm not as worried about this as they are. I'll tell you why I'm not as worried about this, because I think what's going to happen is that women are going to adjust their expectations of the educational credentials of their husbands. They're going to have to. Which
I agree with the second part, but not the first part.
But they won't do. So I think about my own family, right? In my own family, I have someone. She's a nurse. He's a plumber. Right. He's much less educated than her. He also makes a very good living. Are we going to see a world where nurses are going to refuse to marry plumbers just because they didn't get a 4-year degree? I don't think so.
I think we are. But the problem is when we survey, we have lots of women on here. There's other shows that have lots of women. It does not seem like to get a woman to go on a dating app from 6 feet to 5'11" is like pulling teeth. Like the idea that when we ask these women, what do you want as your minimum income for a wage earner? They're saying 170. That's the top 10% of wage earners in the United States. When we ask them about their age or their height or their income, they are not asking for less. And as a result, we're seeing twice as many single men as women. Who are these women dating? Older, successful men.
So there's this thing about, like, someone wrote this piece about you'd wait for Mr. Right. Now you're waiting for Mr. Right, and it used to be like you'd like Mr. Good Enough, etc.
Yeah.
Well, but that height thing, I think there's a bad stat lurking out there, maybe in the manosphere, about this height thing, right? So I looked at this, which is whatever the percentages of women who say on these dating apps, like, I want a guy who's whatever, over 6 foot or something like that. But it's a bad stat because the denominator is of the women who said they had a height preference.
Sure.
And only a minority of women have a height preference.
That's interesting, yes.
So
selection bias, yeah.
So of the ones who say, I have a preference for height, they tend to say you want a taller guy. Well, they're probably why they've said they have it. But only a minority of women click the thing saying, I have a preference for height. So you have to be really careful about these
who's
stats.
making the selection.
Yeah, who's making the selection. So it's massive selection bias of the women who care about height. Of the women who care about height, they tend to prefer their men taller. But but most women say they don't care about height.
You're also basing that data on one statistic, which is like a Tinder dating profile. Yeah. Whereas you can go and look at the work of, like, say, Dr. Rob Henderson or Steve Stewart Williams. When you look at, like, the preference for taller men across the board, then you have to take that.
Everything else equal. Totally agree. But everything else
should you go break your legs to make yourself taller? Probably not.
If you went to my wife and you said, look, don't keep everything about Richard exactly the same, but make him 5'6", right, as opposed to 6'2", would she go for that? No, she'd much rather over 6'2". But she's had plenty of boyfriends and partners who are shorter, but they've had other things about them, right, that make it so.
Sure.
So it's one of these things that I think it's one of those facts that can almost be used against women sometimes, right? It's actually one of those things that sometimes is almost blaming women for the minority.
It's blaming women for their state.
It's the opposite of saying blaming men for actually having a preference for younger women.
5'8" and I'm never going to get laid.
Actually, essentially, Andrew Tate did a clip on this where someone asked him, they called into some show and they said, well, I'm short. I'm a short guy. I'm however tall. And I've said all this stuff. Women will only date kind of taller men. Sure. He said, first of all, that's not true, right? He said something similar to what I've just said.
Yeah.
He said, second of all, you can't change that. These are the cards you've been dealt.
Yes.
Make the most of them. Right. Get yourself in shape. Get yourself a career. Figure yourself. Do not use your height as an excuse
to cope.
Right. And I actually thought, solid advice, right? Because he could have gone the other way with that. He could have said, isn't it unfair how women prefer tall men and richer men? And it's like, it's the feminists. And that then gets into this incel psychology of victimhood, right? It's like, it's boo-hoo because all these women out there will only date like rich, tall, handsome men. And that's just
they're
not
using for rationale.
Exactly. They're rationalizing.
The point is, I agree with you. The thing we were saying, though, is when it came to their standards and we asked them, would you ever lower your standards? The answer was unequivocally no. No.
Let's see.
So I agree with you. In the first part, what we've seen before, though, is that when a woman, for instance, a preference for height, you're right. It's some women who have a preference for height.
Yes,
we've had women on here. But some women, we had CJ Sparks is a great example. Right. Looks were not important to her. The guy needed to make $1 million.
$5 million.
Yeah,
$5 million a year.
We had another girl on here. She dates male strippers. She makes tons of money as a real estate agent. She's only concerned with height and physical attractiveness. So the deviation for what women find attractive is much larger than what it is for men. And so when we see this kind of stuff, when we ask them, would you over time, when we show them the number of men making over $100,000 that are 6 feet tall, and it ends up being like 0.3% of men or some crazy number like that, would you then change your standards? Unequivocally, they say absolutely they will not, and they're going to beat the odds, and they're going to be the one to get the guy who's 6'3", who makes $500,000 a year, who's handsome, and they're not going to settle for anything else.
There's a very useful term in economics that would help us here, right? Which is the difference between preferences and revealed preferences.
Sure.
Which is what people actually do.
Yes.
Right. Here's what people say. Here's what they actually do.
Medium is the message.
And if you ask people, especially, that was a relatively small sample that you've just quoted, and maybe not a random sample of women, right? So you're going to get different answers. But then let's look at what people do. And so, like, we know that men on average are a little bit taller than women. We know there's lots of women who are kind of with shorter men, and they kind of figure it out. So let's see what people actually do rather than what they say. It's a bit like saying, like, men sometimes, I think, can convince themselves maybe that they're going to get like a very beautiful woman, say, right? That kind of sense of...
That's what they would prefer. That's what they would like.
Yeah.
That's what I've convinced myself of.
But actually, when it comes to it, right, other factors are going to bear...
They're mating opportunists.
Yeah, and they're just going to fall in love.
So let me just to backtrack just a little bit here. Like when we're talking about... men and women coming together and forming families, however that looks. We usually call that marriage right now, okay?
Right.
When a couple, statistically speaking, when a couple gets together and the man is making more than the woman and the woman gets a promotion and she makes more money than the man, that is the number one precipitator of divorce in those situations. So the way that I interpret that is that this is a biological mismatch. It's the idea that, well, the guy should be making that. I can't understand why I feel this way, but this is just the way that I feel. And so therefore those end up being, 75% of divorces initiated by women on statistically speaking, in the United States anyways. But
about 2/3,
but the reason why, and I'm not going to harp on data too much, but what I see happening there is it's the biological, it's the evolutionary firmware that says this guy should be the provider. This guy should be the protector. This guy should be parentally invested, and therefore I'm making more money than he is, and so therefore he's dead weight. Now, imagine this. The woman is already established and has a good job, has a good career, went to college, did whatever she's doing, has her own money, whatever else. She has no need for that guy to fulfill that role. That's why you got the girl over here who made like God knows how much money, and she's only interested in hot guys at a certain height because that's what she's lacking. She doesn't need the guy who makes a lot of money and is this educated and everything else because she's already got that.
She can afford to be choosy.
Sure. Exactly. And so what happens, and this is I tried to express this on Dr. Phil, is that when women come to me and say, where can I find, like, how come I don't have my man? Where do I find my man? It's like I'm telling them to dumb themselves down because they've done everything up to this point to be an independent, strong, independent woman of the world. And they get to that point. It's one of the downstream effects we were just talking about, like when you put women into a position of political, economic power, the consequences of that is the evolutionary, the machine doesn't change. So when a woman is, what was the girl who was on here who had, she was the real estate woman who was making $6 million a year.
Savannah Storm is a real estate agent who has sold several $1 million worth of homes. But she sells them to OnlyFans girls who make a bunch of money. So while she's making $5 million, whatever, doing this, she's also having sex on Brazzers. Dudes lost their mind. The idea that this woman who's a porn star is making so much money in real estate was like mind blowing for them. And I brought her on specifically to trigger these guys because I love the idea. Because one of the things that these guys do is like when a woman does not fit a traditional role of a wife, therefore she should have to pay for it. And I'm like, no, guys, that's not the world we live in.
Right.
Women will sit there. I know one girl, she's one of the biggest porn stars in the world. She quits doing porn, and a guy buys her a ring the size of his head and has 2 kids with her. It's like nobody pays for shit anymore, and that was the point I was trying to make with that.
But she's got no use for a guy who is, doesn't make as much money.
So we're in this world. So you refer.
So you have this mismatch between like the biological aspects of things and then the social aspects.
So you refer to this evidence that there's a higher risk of divorce in couples where the wife is earning more than the woman. I don't think it's necessarily that she suddenly overtakes him, which is I think how you framed it. But I think it's Marianne Blanche. I'm trying to remember the exact author of the work that shows that. But it's really hard to know how to interpret that. Because it could just well be that if you've got a marriage that isn't working out very well, it's just much easier to initiate a divorce if you've got the economic resources to do it.
That's an interesting point.
Why do I need this guy?
And in a way, this was the point of this wave of the women's movement. So if you read Steiner and Mead and others, the whole point
women have become the men that they wanted to marry.
But the securing of economic independence wasn't just valuable in and of itself, although it was precisely so that women didn't have to have a man. It was to make men a choice rather than a necessity. And that's happened to a significant degree. Very quickly. Yeah. Now, then you have downstream consequences, which is okay. Yeah. What about the guys? And what's interesting is if you read the conservatives, and I quote people like George Gilder in my book, he was the misogynist of Pig of the Year, I think 2 years running and stuff, and other conservatives who said if the men become superfluous, to use your words, then history would teach us that we're in for a lot of trouble, a lot of crime, a lot of violence. Because actually it's what Joe Henrich calls the math problem of surplus men, right? It's a beautiful phrase in his book, Weird. The math problem of surplus men, and it causes all kinds of violence. And actually there's this really interesting evidence from China that Lena Edlund had, which showed that the result of the one China policy and differential abortion was you had a surplus of men hitting certain Chinese districts at different times, more crime. And so this was the concern, but actually crime's gone down. We've become less violent as a society. And I think that's because men have retreated. I think that rather than acting out, like
we're sedated.
There's this fear of like a Mad Max style world where these bands of marauding surplus men would be kind of wreaking havoc, and in fact the opposite has happened.
They underestimated how lethargic
because porn, strip clubs, and video games.
The internet came. And so here's a really provocative thought: is that rather than screens being the problem, maybe screens have actually helped to save us from some of what might have been the worst consequences of the surplus men. Now, I'm not suggesting it's good, but it might be better than the alternative. And so the conservatives who warned about the effect of these superfluous men didn't anticipate the internet. They didn't anticipate video gaming.
And when we see this same surplus men effect in, like, say, Middle Eastern countries where there is no porn and strip clubs.
There's more violence.
There is more violence. We're going to strap a dynamite to our chest and go into a coffee shop in Tel Aviv.
Or just more generally, I mean, this is actually, Joe Henrich's work on this is actually terrific, I think, where he shows that, like, 95% of societies have been polygamous, and usually polygynous.
Polygynous.
Thank you, for men with multiple wives and not the other way around, right? And then marriage comes along, more monogamy, testosterone goes down because actually that reduces testosterone.
It does.
Violence massively goes down. You don't have this competition, this kind of ferocious competition that there previously was. And so actually his argument is that monogamy, largely promoted by the Christian church, helped to create a peaceful society because it did take away this kind of competition. Certainly. You might end up with a situation now where for a very different reason you have men who are surplus to requirements, not because of polygamy, but because of women's economic independence. Women can go it alone now, but it still leaves a lot of men on the bench. What do? Well, they don't maraud around. They go to the basement. And so I think that's a kind of different order of social problem than the one that perhaps people worried about. But it's not to say it isn't a problem. And I think that's the gap that many men are falling into. They don't feel needed. They don't feel like there's anyone out there relying on them or expecting them to do anything. And then you've got these very accessible alternative forms of, quotes, entertainment that are dopamine addicting and so on. So I think you've created a bit of a cocktail there for male retreat, male passivity, what I call the male malaise. So that's how I see the consequences of this playing out.
Well, one of the things I was stunned by is you did an interview with Chris Williamson, and he asks you unironically, what is the usefulness of men anymore? Do you remember this? And I even think you were taken aback by it because you said I disagreed, but like I think you took it in stride initially and you were like, yeah, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. But there are people who actually like, listen, let the Chinese invade and you will understand the usefulness of men very quickly. I just don't understand. When I heard him say that, I was like, the really good looking, wealthy podcaster from a reality TV show is talking about what is the usefulness of men. I just thought that was really interesting. Right. And that is the viewpoint of some people.
But it's the right question because it's a hard and deep question.
Yeah.
And what happens to the men? What's the role of men in a society where women have to a high degree secured economic independence is a genuinely good question.
Yes.
And one that thoughtful people have been asking.
So both
for
things
a while.
can be true. It is good that women have higher economic independence, and we have a problem because we have a bunch of men that these women don't want.
There's this second round effect, especially when it happens this quickly.
Yes.
Right? When you have a change of this magnitude, this fast.
In 20 years.
I mean, like a generation, right? It's unbelievably quick. And so then it's not surprising that our culture is struggling to catch up, our sense of what it means to be a man is struggling to catch up, etc. And so he's asking the right question because lots of people are addressing that. And I, first of all, I think I'd probably retreat to fatherhood, first of all, because I'm incredibly convinced that dads really matter for their kids' lives.
Yeah.
And so whatever's happening in marriage, whatever's happening between men and women, dads still matter. I don't think fathers are surplus to requirements. And the danger with the old-fashioned message, which is that dads matter because they're breadwinners, is that in a world where that's much less likely to be true now, you're in danger of benching the dads because we're holding them up to obsolete standards of what it means to be a good dad. So they hear that message and they say, well, they don't need me anymore.
I also think the foundation of the question, though, goes back to the idea, well, men keep bankrupting countries and causing wars, and men are bad leaders. And some of these things that are not actually true, they're saying, well, because they keep screwing up everything else. Was it
be better off without them.
Lenny Kravitz was like, men, let's just give it up to the women. We've screwed up everything. Let's just let women take over. I think that's the foundation of that question. I don't actually think...
Right, but I don't... I mean, he doesn't think that. And I honestly think you will struggle to find many women, including almost all feminists, who will honestly tell you that the world would be better off without men.
I think they would tell you that the world would be better off if men weren't running things. I do think they would say that.
I think they would tell you that the world would be better off if it wasn't only men running things. And I completely agree with them. I think the world is better if it isn't only men running things.
Absolutely.
And by the way, but I don't want a world that's only run by women.
Right.
That's the point of gender equality. But I think this idea that there is a sort of a group out there, radical feminists who kind of want to wipe out men in some way.
Let's get into that because I think this is the key.
I need to get a superset.
Okay, for sure.
Travis, can you get the superset?
This is going to be like the key, I guess, debate point for a lot of people. And this is your belief about things going from, say, 13% fewer women in college in 1972 and now 15 points higher today. There are people who believe, one, this is nefarious and conspiratorial, and then there's another group of people that believe this is just sort of like negligent, and you had identity politics where like, I'm worried about getting money for my group, and I just forgot about your group. And you believe it's the second, not the first, that this is just a function of, it just happened to, this is a secondary order, but it wasn't conspiratorial or nefarious. Can you go into that? Because you understand, there's a lot of people watching, this is YouTube, there's a lot of people watching, that's absolutely what they believe. They call it the Matrix. They have all these different names for it. So if you could go specifically into your beliefs about that.
I think that's an incredibly dangerous idea, that the problems that men and boys are facing are the result of some kind of conspiracy, some kind of feminist conspiracy that the women are out to get the men. And of course, you can always find some extremists online who'll say some stuff, or you can go back and read Judith Butler or something.
You guys check out Kill All Men podcast. Kill All Men. It's on Apple right now. You can subscribe.
And then you can generalize that out if you really want to kind of believe in that. But no, what's actually happening? Like, why are men struggling in the labor market? Not because women came along, but because of deindustrialization and free trade. Like, why are men struggling in education? Because the education system isn't quite as friendly towards male styles of learning and towards men as it is to girls and women. Girls have a natural advantage in the education system now. That's showing up in our results. But it's not because some cabal of feminists got together 100 years ago and said, you know what, if we design the education system this way, then eventually, a century from now,
we'll be in charge. We'll be in charge, yes. I get it.
Completely crazy. But it's also crazy not to look at that gap and say, hold on. Something is happening in our education system here. We are not actually educating our boys and men as well as we're educating our girls and women for all kinds of reasons we could get into. That's just true. And that truth can be held without it being some kind of conspiracy. This idea that because something bad is happening in society, it means someone wants that to be happening is almost always wrong and incredibly dangerous to our collective psychology, because it gets into the blame game. I'm suffering. Whose fault is that? Mm-hmm. You look around for someone to blame, and that's almost never the case. And we zero-sum game everything. We look for a villain. There's almost never a villain. There are just social forces, economic forces that are creating real difficulties for real people.
There's another fantastic book. It's called Conquering the Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout. She wrote the first one called The Sociopath Next Door in 2005, and the second one in 2015. When she wrote, or in 2020, when she wrote the book, one of the things she talks about at the end of the book is called corporate sociopathy, and the idea that you take a bunch of empathetic people and put them into a corporate structure, and they are incentivized to do things so that they don't lose their job and that the corporation makes more money. And you take the same thing, and you can extrapolate it to government. I do things to make sure I continue to get reelected and make sure that my tribe and my team wins. And in doing so, I have little to no empathy for other tribes. And when you look at it, when you examine it as corporations are a legal fiction, when you examine the legal fiction as a human being or as an individual entity, it acts like a sociopath. But the people inside of it were not sociopaths. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
It does, yeah. And you've raised the issue of empathy, and I do think that, and I know like this is rational, we're being empirical, etc. But I think that one of the reasons why why men and boys in particular are attracted to a number of male figures is because they feel like they're empathizing with them. They're just understanding that they're struggling. Yeah. Right? And I think understanding that is one of the reasons why a lot of boys and men are drawn to the kind of, you've called it the manosphere, etc. And even to people like Jordan Peterson and so on. It's just because I think, oh, thank goodness he's listening to me. I actually did a Big Think video that's had a lot of views, and I've had so many emails from young men just saying, I was in tears by the end of this video. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for understanding me. All I did was put up a bunch of charts.
Let me put a pin here. I got to get to Superchats.
Right? Do it real quick.
Just 20 and up is fine. Travis?
Yeah, sure. From Louis, 1999 Super Chat. Amazing conversation, he says. Good job, guys.
Thank you.
ML with a 20-pound Super Chat. In the case of male aggressivity, in my own story, my father was the one who coached me to control my violence, not the rest of society.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was going to say, like, men are fathers in particular are a buffer again. How do we teach men? Yeah, exactly. Okay, go ahead, Trev.
Pat Stedman's Polished Passport with a $20 super chat. Mr. Reeves, that informal language is how a broad range of people from blue collar to informal white collar communicate. Corporate media and academia is more concerned with the specific words than average Joes.
Is that it? By the way, shout out to the 1,000 people that are watching us in the super chat right now. That's pretty awesome that we're doing that. One other thing I want to talk about, I really love.
We got any more? Is there?
We got more.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah, finish the rest.
Another one from Pat Stedman's Polished Passport, $20 super chat, pointing out that most people benefiting from student loan cancellation are women, and that they choose industries that don't pay enough. Yeah. Is that men being exploited for votes, or pointing out an uncomfortable reality?
I was going to say, is like when you were saying, like, how conservative politicians want to appeal to that sort of masculine ideal and say that, we'll be the ones to represent you kind of thing. The point I was making, at least in this last election cycle, is from the Democrat, the more liberal side of the political spectrum, the fear or the sort of the stoking of emotions for women is you're going to lose your right to an abortion. Right. You're going to, or we're going to give you student debt consolidation, which of course women holds like two-thirds of that, $1.7 trillion in debt. So we're going to give you basically a stimmy check so that you can come election time. Again, so it's really kind of done both sides if you think about it. So if you got women who are in dire financial straits as a result, so therefore here's your blood.
So what I saw going into the election was that the Dems are going to kind of double down on trying to win women's votes, especially in the suburbs. And so the student debt cancellation was described as a gender justice issue because 2/3 of college debt is owned by women. There was no mention, by the way, of the fact that the infrastructure bill was going to create 2/3 of the jobs are going to go to men, especially working class men. And then on the other side, of course, you do get Republicans who are really kind of doubling down on kind of male votes and working class votes, in part by saying the Democrats are obsessed with sex, gender, birthing people or whatever. And so what I'm fearing is that the polarization we've seen in our politics is now getting quite gendered as well. And we don't want a world where we've got a women's party and a men's party.
See, that's why it's a real worry. Whenever we get into an election cycle, that's the first thing out of my mouth is like all politics today are gender politics. Both sides are playing that gender card now in a way, and you are seeing men moving towards the Republicans, including
like Hispanic and black men, for example.
Yeah, because they think that's where they're going to be. That's where the empathy is.
That's where they'll get heard, and vice versa. And then women moving to the Dem side.
So let's talk about this.
Let me get are there any more? 20 and up?
Yes, there is. David Jones, $20 super chat for the top 15%, but the real problem is that their expectation effect on average women. I'm in the top 25% of earners, and it's looked at as average. Average women don't want average men until they're ready to settle.
Mm-hmm. What's in it? I think there's one. Is there one more? I think there.
I had to refresh them.
Okay, I got Adventuresome Brada says best discussion I've seen on the subject matter. Props to Rollo for being on point. Good.
Beautiful. There's something you mentioned before about men not being heard or people not being heard. So let's talk about Barack Obama in 2008. He spoke to a group of African Americans that felt disenfranchised. 95% of those African Americans voted for him. Donald Trump in 2016, he spoke to coal miners, people who had lost their jobs because of industrialization, because of global industrialization. Those people voted for him in a large amount because they felt they weren't being spoken to. And we saw on TikTok 12 billion individual searches of Andrew Tate's name, and at one point in August of last year, him being the most searched human being on the planet, because he was speaking to a group of people that were not being heard. I have this conversation with feminists often. If you completely disagree with everything Andrew Tate says, that's fine. My point is, why did he grow so big so fast? Is it because we're all stupid troglodyte misogynists? Or was there a group of men that you don't even, as a feminist, acknowledge they have needs and wants and desires as well? When I explained to them a third of men under the age of 30 are having no sex, they can't believe this fact. They don't believe it's real. What can you speak to that whole idea? And the last thing, depths of despair, places where Trump won.
He did much better there.
Yeah, can you go into that whole concept?
So, Donald Trump talked about the forgotten Americans, right? He talked about the people, and he just made, he made a bunch of people feel heard, right, seen. That turned out to be very politically powerful for him. And of course, that is something that politicians want to do. And to say, look, we see you, we hear you, and they don't, right? The other side don't. When it comes to figures like Andrew Tate and others, I do think you're right, that what's much more interesting to me is not what
why do you think they were popular? Why do you think Andrew Tate was popular?
Well, it's on the demand side, right? It's not what they're supplying that's interesting. It's why are people interested in them? And I think the problem is that there are kind of different mixed up reasons why he was popular. And the challenge is to kind of pull those apart a little bit. So number one, he's transgressive. He was transgressive, right? And so if you're an adolescent, and especially if you're an adolescent boy, transgression's really exciting. And so the way to transgress now is to transgress against kind of mainstream orthodoxy around issues like
punk rock.
Right?
That's what it is.
Right. So fine. So transgression, number one. And sometimes it's a bit funny and producing. Secondly, there was some stuff where he was actually giving straightforward advice to people, and it wasn't always terrible, as I kind of suggested earlier. Thirdly, there was some straightforward misogyny in there, just pretty pure misogyny, which is just women are lesser than men. They are second-class citizens. They should go back to whatever it was. And I'm not saying that was the bulk of what he was putting out, but it was definitely there as well. And so if you put all those things together, what you have to disaggregate, which is, sorry, did I say empathy already as one of the things? So, don't assume that everybody that was interested in him was just taking all the misogyny on board and saying, okay, Andrew, yes, I'll become a misogynist as well. Actually, they were discounting that, quite a lot of them, but they were saying, at least he sees me, at least he understands what I'm going through, or whatever it is. So he was ticking that box. And I think that the difficulty is it's easier for some people to just think, everybody who looks at him must be a misogynist.
Correct.
Right? But we have to worry about, even if you go to him for other reasons than misogyny, will it be corrosive in the long term, especially for kind of younger men and boys, for those things to be packaged together. Well, right? And that's I think we need to unbundle the appeal of people.
I was going to say that I think that the reason why a guy like Andrew Tate is popular, and there will be others, by the way, too, is because he's the purple cow in the field of brown cows right now. There's so much I don't malaise, I guess, to use one of your words, that when a guy like Andrew Tate comes in, he seems like fresh. He seems like there's something new. He seems like this is the action hero, right? We need an Arnold Schwarzenegger or a Sylvester Stallone. We don't have those archetypes. We don't have those archetypes in popular culture anymore. So what is popular culture in 2023? It's the internet. So when Andrew Tate comes out, and he will say that's the character he plays. That's one of the things he's saying right now, right? Whether it's a character or whether it's not, I know we both know Andrew personally, but whether it's a character or it's not a character, the appeal of that character is he's Han Solo, he's Captain Kirk, he is that unapologetically masculine guy, conventionally masculine guy that it's a breath of fresh air. They've never heard. That's why he's so
transgressive.
So
I've got to tell you, as
yeah.
a Star Wars fan, I'm going to ask you to retract the comparison between
Han Solo
and
okay. Well, you get a scoundrel. How can we say a scoundrel?
I mean, he says scoundrel, right? But Andrew Tate is not Han Solo. What Andrew Tate is doing, I think, is he's taking this sort of adolescent performative kind of masculinity, right, and putting it out there, sometimes quite knowingly. I think it is a performance quite often, and I also think that a lot of the young people are able to kind of see what's performative and what isn't.
I mean, speaking to him personally, he's not. I don't think he's the same person offline as he is online. I
assume that there's a kind of. But the other thing, of course, he's done is he mastered the algorithm of short form video content before anybody else.
I'm glad you picked up on that conversation.
His father was a chess grandmaster, and I think he's very
smart guy.
And the more hated he is, the better he does. So when Greta Thunberg kind of tweets at him, that's great for him because the more haters you get,
the
more
play the game.
He knows how the algorithm thrives on conflict. And he just absolutely mastered that, and you saw the result.
So my question, though, is where did those men come from? What is happening in society to manufacture that many men who felt unheard? A third of men not having any sex, 80% of men on dating apps being deemed unattractive. What manufactured that? That we wouldn't. He doesn't have those search results unless there's a group of men that don't feel heard. What's making them not feel heard?
Well, I think the first thing is that it is back to the transgression point, which is that if it's really transgressive to point out that a lot of boys and men are really struggling in school and in relationships.
But a lot of them are really struggling.
They are really struggling, right? And so this is if you have a group of people who are really struggling and pointing that out and trying to do something about it is something that mainstream institutions and responsible people are not doing, and that becomes like a shocking thing to point out. I think that's part of it. And so what's happened is there's a real reservoir of actual need and hurt and struggle among a lot of men and boys. And if that's not being articulated, discussed in sort of mainstream forums, then the appetite to hear about that is still there. So we create a vacuum. The failure of mainstream institutions and media organizations to be talking just straightforwardly about these issues creates a vacuum.
You said when responsible people do not have this conversation, irresponsible people will start to have this conversation.
They'll exploit them, and they might exploit them for clicks. They might exploit them for monetary value. So I think it's Andrew Tate, to that extent, is our fault. And by our fault, I mean mainstream institutions, think tanks, government, universities, who aren't talking about these problems of boys and men, or if they're doing it in a way that's kind of a semi-embarrassed, quick. Could we get this over with?
I tried to make that point on Dr. Phil. I was saying, we could not have that conversation.
Right.
Even the conversation we were having on Dr. Phil, we could not have that at a major university without getting shouted down.
And I think I said that I am actually having that conversation at universities now, which I am. But I think I'm doing it. But I think partly I'm creating permission. I think what I'm doing, because I'm coming up with all these
permission
facts,
for the discussion.
Permission for the discussion.
Permission for the discussion.
Right, because it's like, he's a Brookings guy. He's got charts. He seems reasonable. He sounds funny.
Nobody's ever thrown anything at you.
Right, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay.
Early days.
That's where you go.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's because, and what I've discovered is that actually most people do want to talk about this. They just want to talk about it in a way that doesn't require them to give up their prior commitments, say, to the service of women and girls. As long as it's not zero sum. There's a huge appetite out there for this conversation. And if we're not having it, if I'm not having it, if mainstream institutions aren't having it, someone's having it.
I'm glad you said that, because I have the same discussion in the area of physics or science when we get into vaccines cause autism, we didn't land on the moon, or the earth is flat. Because normal, accredited PhDs don't want to have this conversation, or MDs don't want to have this conversation with who they deemed to be lunatics, then it ends up on Joe Rogan, who has a bigger audience than all of you combined. And now the discussion, because it's not happening between responsible people, it's now happening between irresponsible people.
If there are hard things happening, hard questions, and you just ignore them, right, and hope that that no one will notice them, that doesn't happen. People will notice them, and they will pick them up. I'll give you an example. I was having an argument with, I would describe him as a men's rights activist. I don't know if he would accept the guy who was a private conversation. He said, well, they don't care about male suicide. I said, okay, who's they? And he said, the government, CDC. I said, I'm sure they do care. Why do you say that? He sent me a link. The link was to the CDC page on disparities in suicide, and it doesn't have a subsection by gender. It does veterans, it does LGBTQ, it doesn't have it. And I'm looking at this while I'm on the phone with this guy, and he's saying, you see, There isn't a section on the CDC website on disparities in suicide that points out that there's a 4-fold gap in suicide. And I'm cursing the CDC bureaucrats while I'm on the phone with this guy because I can't tell him he's crazy when they haven't got that on the website. So I'm like, for the love of God, put that on the website. Have a whole section. Have a task force on male mental health. Get the Gender Policy Council to do work on boys and men so that the next time I'm on the phone with that guy, I can say, you're crazy.
But could it be because there are people in the CDC who are so politically progressive, they do not want to have that subset? Could that possibly be the reason?
Yeah. I think that's right. I think for some of them, actually,
I would go one step further.
Or they're worried they'll be criticized by.
Well, recently I'm watching. In fact, I did a show or a part of a show last Sunday on this. Ben Shapiro was like very concerned that there's these new findings that young girls are attempting suicide more these days, and I'm like. But Jesus Christ, they're not killing themselves at 3.5 to 5 times the rate of guys. But that's what he talks about, and he does not want to talk about the fact that it's been that way for a very long
let's just talk about this real quick because a lot of people are going to be very confused by this.
Yeah, we only got 6 more
men
minutes.
and women attempt suicide at about the same rate. Men commit suicide at a much higher rate because they tend to jump off of bridges and put guns in their mouth. That's why I'm just going to be honest with you. That's the difference versus sleeping pills. That's kind of where the difference happens, or slitting your wrist. That's kind of where those disparities happen. Last question I want to ask you. You said masculinity is more feminine than femininity.
More fragile.
More fragile, sorry. Masculinity more fragile than femininity throughout time. Can you go into describe that?
Yeah, when you talk about fragile masculinity, it sounds like a slur, right? It sounds like a bit of an eye-rolling thing that actually some people would say from the other side of the argument. What I mean by that is the construction of masculinity, and especially mature masculinity, it's just a bit more social. It's a more of a cultural task. It doesn't come quite as naturally, because we don't have quite the same sort of obvious reproductive markers, right, as women. And that's why I think societies have very often had to work quite hard to have certain rites of passage, to have certain ways of learning around what it means to go from boy to man. And so what I mean by the sense it's more fragile is that it is more socially constructed, that it's more of a task for a culture and for a society to figure out how we're going to help boys to become men, how we're going to teach them what it means to be a good and a mature man. I don't think it comes quite as naturally as it does for women. Now, it's not to say there aren't social constructions around femininity as well, but I think masculinity is more of a cultural task than femininity is, which is why I don't think you very often hear about a crisis of femininity.
I've written about exactly this too. It's this idea, really since the time of the sexual revolution, when women start to become more independent. That's when guys start saying, well, should I be macho? Should I not be macho?
How should I be?
How should I be kind of thing. We're at a point right now, I think, here we are like almost 60 years later, where guys of certainly the last 2 generations, if not the last 4, are not necessarily questioning their masculinity or having it questioned all the time. It's they're self-loathing when it comes to that. It's bad to be a man. Not boys will be boys will be good humans, right? Or else it's I don't know what masculinity is, so it's subjective and I'll create it for myself, rather than having some sort of concrete. We would not be having this conversation in a pre-sexual revolution society in the 50s or 40s. That's why we keep hearkening back to those times, because that's the only point we can remember.
It wasn't a question.
Like, your grandfather would not have this conversations. What is a man? What is a woman? That would be simply self-evident. But now I think really as women have become more masculinized and have become more independent of men, what that's done is it's opened up opportunities for sort of exploiting this uncertainty of generations of men. As well, what is a man? Well, a real man does X. A real man does this. And whatever X is tends to be the pet ideology of whoever has that interest in convincing that guys, toxic masculinity is this, but real men do this. So and whatever this is usually representative of what that ideology is.
Yeah, and I agree with the fact that there's this period of flux and uncertainty, and we're asking questions about what does it mean to be a man. By the way, women too. I mean, it was true. My grandmother didn't have to. Really
they didn't have to ask that question.
But it's the same for like a lot of women now, kind of figuring out like, I know how to be a woman. And what we've done is we've expanded the range of ways that we can be masculine and can be feminine, and the roles we can play. And that is both a wonderful thing and a very challenging thing. Obviously, the world's much easier when society just tells you how to be. Yeah. Right, and all you've got to do is follow orders. That's very easy. It's very hard to be in a society where, oh wait, there's 1,000 ways to do this. Crikey, that's hard. But what we shouldn't do is just abandon people to that. What we shouldn't do is say, okay, fine, good luck figuring this out. We should be helping them figure it out. And I think the key thing is not to throw out the very idea of masculinity just because we're expanding it and giving it more choice. And potentially, this is a really wonderful thing that we're having here. I know we've focused on the crisis, and there's lots of really difficult things going on, but potentially this could be great. It could be wonderful going forward to say, you don't have to stop being a guy, you don't have to stop being masculine, but look at all these different things you can do now, these different ways you can be masculine. I was able to stay at home and care for my kids. That was not something that my dad had as an option. I'd still consider myself to be a guy, and I think I probably parented slightly differently, but what a wonderful world it is that allowed me to be that kind of guy as well as this kind of guy.
I would argue that also, and I know we're out of time, but I would also argue this. We were talking about teachers a little while ago, and there's a definite deficit in teachers. It's in the UK, Canada, and the United States right now. 77% of your teachers today, from preschool all the way to post-secondary, will be females.
Yes.
In the United States, it's higher in other countries, actually.
Yes.
And so because those jobs are not, men don't see teaching as a career path because they tend to be low paying, and there's very little status involved in all of that. So it's like they're not going to be selected because they're teachers. It's better to be a professional athlete or a rock star or whatever it is than it is to be a teacher. And so the idea of, we can play these different roles now as guys, and we've got this, I can be Mr. Mom or whatever else. The problem is with those roles is that it doesn't eliminate the biological proclivities of men and women to think that, if I'm a teacher, it'd be great and a noble cause and it's a noble profession, but I'm only going to make $45,000 a year, and I'm never going to be able to get with the hot girls that he's at Zook. That's a kind of that's whether that's a cognitive recognition or not. But
it's not conscious.
So those new roles that are opening up conflict with our old evolutionary firmware, I guess. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Well, they don't have to, though. I mean, you take teaching as an example, and I think I'm a bit obsessed with that. We need more men in our classrooms, for sure.
I think we do, actually.
But in 1980, 40% of elementary and middle school teachers were male. Now it's 20%. So it's become a female profession. It didn't used to be. It used to be a perfectly honorable thing for guys to do.
Yeah, because we think they're all going to be kitty touchers.
Whatever the reason is.
And you brought up that that boys tend to do better in subjects they struggle at when they have
English.
male teachers.
Like English. Yeah.
And that women actually do the same. They do better in STEM when they have female teachers.
I think that's a huge reason, but also the other reason to have more male teachers is they're more likely to be coaches after school and so on too. And I just think that idea that we should have institutions generally where there are representatives of both sexes, right? So we want more female members of Congress, and we want more male elementary school teachers, don't we?
Sure.
So that our boys see men teaching, including things like English, and our girls see women passing laws, right? That's the future we want.
Do you think it would be more impressive to have a woman working in construction or raw sewage or something? That's a longshoreman kind of thing. Would that be more impressive than, say, a woman who goes to Congress? Because we still have a deficit in those jobs, because women don't choose to become, sanitation workers. Okay, they choose to be I want to get into a higher.
Well, I don't blame them.
I don't either. But the thing is if we're going to talk about, we need to see more men in this, and we need to see more.
Well, you could say the same thing about healthcare assistants, care home, pretty poorly paid. Those are almost all women.
Well, I think it's interesting that we demonize, and I'm gonna give you a point here. I think it's interesting that we demonize, say, major universities and say they're going to be these feminist indoctrination camps and everything else, but yet we still pay those teachers so low that I'm pretty sure socialism looks like a pretty damn good deal to people who are in those institutions, because we don't take care of those teachers. We don't value them enough. If you want to put more men into teaching positions, you've got to make it more appealing. Got to incentivize it, and it will never until we incentivize those things. It's going to.
But we knew that too. We had to incentivize. We had to help women get into traditionally male roles with scholarships and so on too. So we should do the same. We need a massive recruitment drive of men into our schools, especially to teach subjects like English, because if they don't see men in those institutions, they're not around men, they don't have male teachers showing them, to some extent, just performing masculinity, just showing what it means to be a guy. Back to this point about Andrew Tate, right? If you have a boy, say, who maybe has lost touch with his father, maybe there aren't many men in his community, Maybe he doesn't go to church or there aren't school, groups around. Then he goes to school where there are no male teachers, no male coaches. It's perfectly possible that he could get sort of close to adolescence and not have had any strong male role models in his life. There is nobody that thinks that's a good idea. Nobody. And so one thing we can do about that from a policy point of view is let's at least get more men into our classrooms.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's do super chats, and then we're going to do an outro. Do you have any more super chats you want to read?
No, is there any more pressing there, Travis? I think I saw two.
They're like all $20 super chats because I think they
realize that. Yeah. Just give me the last like three, I suppose. There, I'm looking at them right now.
Yes, sir. We got Terrell Xavier saying RR said that women don't need to rely on men is good. Problem. That ignores the reality that population collapse is the most dangerous thing humans can do to themselves. Also, Andrew never said women were less than men. Xavier for $20 super chat. ML with the $20 pound super chat. When women are independent financially, it is shifting the hypergamy criteria towards hot dudes. Consequence: 80% of men become invisible to women. This endangers monogamy. More positive for peace in society, according to you.
Okay. And last
one is
Jethro.
Refro, $20 super chat. The biggest reason for all this because women are not growing their natural biological superpower, and neither are men. Women superpower is nurturing humans, and man is to nature the world for humans to be in full circle.
There we go.
Hey guys, let's use Grammarly from now on, and let's try to get these things grammatically
English is
correct.
your second
Makes
language.
it a little harder for us to read these.
We need more male English
teachers. This is why we need more male English teachers.
Dr. Reeves, cannot tell you what an honor it is to have you. I want to say thank you so much.
We got to bring you back. Yeah. I could go forever.
For sure. But having you come on here, I would love to have him on Access Vegas, to be honest.
Yeah, that would be
incredible.
Great.
Might get in trouble with the wife.
Hey, boys.
Anyway, so the thing is, I just want to let you know, obviously, we had I want to have an apolitical discussion where we just deal with facts, and I always want you to know you're welcome. Anybody else who's out there is welcome, because a lot of times what happens is there's this belief that we can't all have these conversations, or there's like some internet beef, or not with you, obviously, not with you, but there's some people who are like, well, we can't have a rational discussion about this, and I really do appreciate you coming and having the discussion, and just wanting to let you know. Because some people might actually have this idea that they're not welcome, or the idea that we're going to become cantankerous or acrimonious, and we're definitely not going to happen. So thank you so much for doing us the honor of coming on here. I really appreciate that. Where can we find your book? It is Of Boys and Men. Where can we find your book and
Yes,
you?
Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why it Matters and What to Do About It. All good bookstores. I also have a Substack, which is called Of Boys and Men. So if people want to check out my work, they can do that, or obviously through the Brookings or on my Twitter feed. But I want to thank you, because I think that's the point. We don't want to have spaces where we just can't engage and sometimes deeply disagree with each other, but in a productive way. That's the point.
Oh, well, you cannot test the strength of an idea unless you have open debate.
Correct.
Beautiful. Can't wait to have him debate Andrew Tate.
The crucible of open debate.
I'm here for that one.
You're here for that one. Beautiful. I love that. Awesome. We'll set that up for you. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you all for watching. Man, over 1,000 people in this watching us today. I really, really appreciate it. He's got to run to another appointment, but this has been absolutely fantastic. Having more academics on here is something that we really look forward to. We really, really want to do, because listen, man, I don't like this idea. I only believe things because the Republicans say it or because the Democrats say it. We believe in things because they're empirically true and because we can prove them.
Because strength of the idea.
The strength of the idea. I have had my mind changed several times by Dr. Buss and other academics. So I just say thank you. You've actually changed my mind on a few things. So I appreciate that, guys. We will see you all next week.
Bye, guys.
All right. Hey, David.